Dude, don't make me spit out my canopy bird. Are you recording?
It's recording.
Good, use that.
We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things. Not because they're easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we are willing to accept, one that we are unwilling to postpone, and one in which we intend to win. And the others too. Do you know what speech that is?
I do not.
That is the JFK speech from September 12th, 1962. That was the speech that JFK gave to the American people to rally them for this ambitious project about going to the moon.
All right.
On this week's episode, Science versus Conspiracy, talk the moon landing over coffee. If the moon landing was a hoax, who is behind it? What's the evidence? We'll get into it right after the break. Welcome back to Science versus Conspiracy over coffee. Speaking of which, Science, what kind of coffee do we have today?
Canopy bird. That is my little jingle. Salt Spring. You can hire me to sing it for you if you want. This is a Salt Spring coffee that we absolutely love. It is one of my favorites. Again, this is not an ad. We're just doing this because we like to. Canopy Bird is a medium dark roast, and it's got a little bit of a, excuse me, it's got a little bit of like a syrupy, caramel, chocolatey note to it. And I just love it. It's my favorite. I love the smell. I love the taste. Yeah, Canopy Bird.
I love it too. All right, so we're talking about the moon landing today. And in 1969, we went to the moon, or so they say. So we're going to do a bit of a deep dive into the history, how we got there, or how we didn't get there, rather. As usual, science over here will debunk.
I'll be talking about what I think really happened. And conspiracy over there, we'll be talking about the conspiracy theories behind it. So there we go.
Yeah, and my actual thoughts have changed over the years because this is one of the things that growing up, what kind of got me into this whole conspiracy thing is that my family would sit around the table and my aunts and uncles would come over and we would all talk about conspiracy theories. And this one was one of the main ones that came up all the time.
Okay.
Did we actually go to the moon?
Okay.
How is it possible for us to get there
Right.
in 1969?
Right.
And why haven't we been back?
Okay.
So, it all kind of started back in 1957 when the Soviet R-7 intercontinental ballistic missile was launched. Launched Sputnik into outer space, and this kind of really scared the U.S. And, like, we really got to get a move on. And
Right.
at this time, 1957, NASA wasn't a thing. It was just the Air Force, and they saw this as a huge threat. So by 1958, the U.S. Army launched Explorer 1, which was kind of
Their response.
their response.
Yeah.
Their response to Sputnik. They needed to get something up there. And then that's later that same year, Dwight D. Eisenhower signed the creation of NASA. So 1958, creation of NASA.
Okay.
Because before that, like I said, it was just the U.S. Army.
Okay.
So then that started off the space race, and there was already the Cold War going on
Yeah.
between the U.S. and Russia. So this was just upping the ante even more. They wanted to be the first in space, and they wanted to be the first. They wanted to dominate space. Unfortunately, the U.S. failed to get the space first. Yuri Gagarin, I can never
I
say
don't
his name
know,
properly.
honestly.
Yuri Gagarin was the first human. We're going with this. There's other things that we can get
Sure.
into later in later episodes. But according to our history, he was the first human to be launched into space successfully.
And he was Soviet.
And he was Soviet.
Okay.
Yeah. So then in 1962, JFK gave that famous speech that I mentioned at the beginning, that I read at the beginning. That really got everybody going to create the moon landing project. So there was a bunch of series, Gemini and Mercury, and finally Apollo. So then in 1969, sorry. And I should mention, 2 months after JFK gave that speech on September 12th, 1962, in November of that year, November 22nd, he was assassinated.
Yes.
So we'll get into that in another episode too,
Yes.
because I think this probably played a small part in the assassination, but I think that there was larger pieces at play
Okay.
for him to be assassinated.
Okay.
So, anyways, 1969, July 20th, 1969, NASA launches astronauts Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins towards the moon. Can you imagine being Michael Collins on that mission? Flying all that way to the moon and not even being able to land on it and step foot on it? Being so close. It would have been crazy. I don't know how he could have done that. Anyway, that's a whole other thing. It wasn't until about 1976 when conspiracy theories about the moon landing being a hoax started to pop up. So the main conspiracy theory here is that the moon landing was actually filmed on a soundstage. One of the theories is like, who would have been able to film it? Well, in 1968, right before the moon landing, Stanley Kubrick created 2001: A Space Odyssey, which a lot of people credit him as the director of the moon landing, done in a soundstage. And
Which we saw last night on the X
we saw
Files.
that in X-Files.
Rewatching season 11, we saw the smoking man coordinating that behind the scenes.
AKA George W. Bush. Or H.W. Bush, rather, sorry. But anyways, Stanley Kubrick is supposedly behind the special effects in the moon landing because he had already put together some really amazing, convincing footage for 2001.
Okay. Okay, so you gotta let me respond here. Are
Okay.
you just gonna list it all out
No. Okay.
and then I respond?
Okay, so go back.
Or what do you want to do?
Stanley Kubrick, fake moon landing.
How do you want to do this?
Go for it.
Okay, he didn't fake the moon landing. What's your proof?
Well, according to the theories, the proof is in The Shining.
Okay. Go ahead.
So, Stanley Kubrick's movie The Shining, the 1980 film,
Yeah, the original version.
the original version, the floor, the carpeting at the hotel is supposed to be an exact copy of the launch pad
Sure.
over and over and over again. Mm-hmm. And speaking of over and over and over again, the all work and no play
Makes Jack a dull boy.
makes Jack a dull boy. So if you break out all
A11.
Apollo 11,
Uh-huh. Don't forget Danny's sweater.
Danny's sweater with the Apollo moon landing on it. Mm-hmm. There's a 237. Danny stands in front of the door.
Why is 237 significant?
That was the distance between the Earth and the Moon.
237,000 miles.
Yeah.
And in the book, it was room 217.
Right.
So they changed it to room 237 in the movie.
Yep.
Wow. So really, he created this big, expensive movie as an apology for faking the moon landing?
Well, not as an apology.
Oh, that's what they say. They say his conscience couldn't
Well, yeah.
handle it
I
anymore.
guess I wasn't thinking of it as an apology, more as a, hey, I did it and I need to get this out there,
Okay, so
but not apologizing for it.
okay. Can't it just be that he's a space buff and he created 2001 and then he was doing all these other movies and so he wanted to throw in little nods to space because he likes space?
It's possible.
Yes, it's possible.
It's possible.
Yes. Do you have any other supposed evidence that Stanley Kubrick orchestrated this?
That's it for the Stanley Kubrick bits.
Okay, because I actually found some more supposed evidence
Okay.
that is also debunked.
Okay.
So let me throw this out there. So one of them is just really funny because everybody says, okay, so if he had the the technological skill and everything to create the moon landing at the time, why isn't Eyes Wide Shut a better movie? Decades later. So that's a funny joke. I've never actually seen Eyes Wide Shut. I know you have.
I have.
And it stunk, right?
It wasn't that great.
Yeah.
Partly the acting, Tom Cruise, I'm not a huge fan.
Right.
But also Steven Spielberg finished it.
Yeah. But they said still it would have been infinitely less boring if he actually had all the skill and technology to fake the moon landing. But that joke aside, there was one guy named William Casing who wrote a book called We Never Went to the Moon, America's $30 billion Swindle.
Yep.
Right?
I was going to get to that, but go ahead.
Okay, cool. Yeah. So I know he details a bunch of this in his book too. So one other thing that's come out, this supposed filmmaker Patrick Murray, he claims that he interviewed Stanley Kubrick 3 days before his death. Have you
Yes.
heard this one?
Yes, and I've seen the video on YouTube.
And his video,
Yes.
which then actually shows a completely different date, which is 3 months after Kubrick's death. So there's
Yeah.
discrepancies in the dates.
Yeah, it's been a while since I've seen it. I saw it when it was first made public, I guess.
Okay.
But there was a lot of controversy around it, and a lot of people were debunking it at face value.
Yeah, because they were saying like the guy that is supposedly Kubrick in the interview, although he might look a lot like him, he doesn't act like him.
Yeah.
And you can actually hear this filmmaker directing him how to act more like Kubrick at one point, and he calls him Tom, supposedly.
Yeah, I don't remember that part, but it's possible.
Yeah.
I didn't pay too much attention to it because it didn't seem legit to me.
Yeah. So, I mean, there you go. You yourself didn't think it was legit.
Well, that interview.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think it's entirely possible that he could have had something to do with the moon landing.
So, if he had all that time and money and everything to fake the moon landing, what does he get out of it?
He gets out of the satisfaction of knowing that he was able to pull this off and fool the world and create this masterpiece that will go on for like human history. One of the pivotal moments in world history was when we landed on the moon. So if he was the one to set that all up, it's his legacy.
Isn't it more logical just to think we actually went there?
In 1969, the technology was barely there. We went to the moon with less power than a modern toaster and the computing power of a 1980s digital watch.
Really?
Yeah.
That's funny. They used a toaster and a watch.
Yeah, like
Essentially.
aside from the rockets and all that
Yeah, yeah.
power, but like the
Yeah.
actual lander and the vehicle that got them to the moon
Yeah.
was supposedly running on less power than like a modern day toaster.
But who's to say it couldn't have been done?
My biggest argument here is if we went to the moon, why haven't we been back? And I hear that all the time. Like, why haven't we been back? And every time NASA announces a new moon mission, something comes up a few months later and it gets scrapped. Budget cuts. Something's always there that prevents us from going back. And the technology, they say, isn't there, and it's going to cost like hundreds of billions of dollars to get back to the moon to develop new rockets. But like, wouldn't they have the plans that they could at least build what they built back in 1969?
Yeah, but how do we know? Like our planet, for example, has undergone massive changes with respect to, climate change, right? And I know that's another conspiracy theory, but the distance through space, that journey may have also undergone changes. The surface of the moon may have undergone changes. Now we have extra high powered telescopes and whatnot that can see better. Maybe they want to prepare better for, excuse me, I'm losing my voice. Maybe they want to prepare better for such an event. And then who's to say that these budget cuts, etc., that come up aren't real? Because we know they haven't prioritized it like they did then. They haven't prioritized the space journeys as they did.
Right. That's one of the reasons why they canceled the Apollo missions, was because it was just another thing that when Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin came back from space, they had parades, and even like through the Gemini and Mercury missions, they had parades when these guys came back from space.
Yeah.
And the first part of the moon missions, and then it just became another thing, another news story on page 5.
Yeah.
So that it wasn't there. The space exploration wasn't there. We were in Vietnam.
A lot of
and-
other stuff came up
Yeah.
that wasn't as, the space race wasn't as important anymore. Wars and recessions and famines, and we became a more global community, and there was much more to deal with.
Right, exactly. But that drive for exploration of space, it's the final frontier.
Yeah. I think it's still happening, though. They're still doing stuff.
We're sending robots, and
But look at what happened with Challenger. Like, they have to take these things seriously.
oh yeah,
right?
there was tons of deaths and explosions and rocket disasters during the early moon missions, like during Gemini and Mercury.
So they're not just going to send people out there willy-nilly if they're not, completely satisfied with what they've done to prepare and what the technology is.
But look what Elon Musk is doing with SpaceX. He's gotten farther in less time. He's going to land on Mars in the next couple of years. Like his rockets are there.
Yeah.
NASA is still like trying to figure out how to pick their nose in space.
But aren't they... That's a good one. Aren't they pairing with him, though? Like, I thought they were partnering with him for some of this.
Well, his one rocket is being used to shuttle astronauts back and forth to the space station.
Right. They're shutting down the ISS, which is so sad.
Yeah, so that's a whole nother thing.
Yeah.
But sending his rockets, his big rocket or whatever it's called,
Yeah, I don't know.
it's going to be ready to launch to Mars, and his whole concept, or not concept, but his whole production of and business plan of creating rockets is completely different than the way NASA's going about it. And I think that's why because he's a private business, he needs to. He's in the business of making money.
Yeah,
NASA's
for sure.
in the business of government.
Yeah. Yeah. And we know government never does anything efficiently, and things take time, and there's bureaucratic red tape. And, look at what's been going on in the States. Like, really, space exploration is not their priority.
Right. And I think it should be, but one of their priorities.
Well, I think feeding the children and keeping them safe, especially considering the horrific shooting yesterday in Texas, definitely outweighs space exploration. But anyway, I
anyways,
digress.
Yeah.
That's my little passionate rant for the moment. We need to get back to the conspiracy theory.
We need to get back to the conspiracy theory. So some of the stuff that people say why the moon landing is fake is like the flags waving in the breeze.
Okay, let's talk about these one at a time.
Okay, so Neil Armstrong plants the flag in the moon, and it's sticking straight out, but then you see it waving a little bit. So.
No. So what it is, they had to insert a horizontal rod as well to keep it because of the gravity and the pull. So
Right.
they've got the vertical rod that you plant in the ground, and then there's actually a horizontal rod across the top. And they've done this with like pretty much every mission that they've done. This the fabric and the rod are all made special by NASA, but what you see that causes that looking like rippling effect in the wind is actually the rod was only stretched partially out. So if you imagine that you haven't pulled your curtain rod out all the way and your curtain is still bunched up, that's what happened. And so with the effect of it, with the shadows, etc., on the flag, it looks like it's rippling, but it's just the fabric bunched up.
Right. So I've heard that too.
Okay, cool.
The other thing is you mentioned shadows. The shadows is one of the hugest. The shadows is one of the largest pieces to this puzzle. Is that the shadows don't match up with the one light source of the sun.
Okay.
That the shadows are going in different different directions and they're not parallel like they should be, suggesting that it's a studio light or some smaller light source.
Right.
And even multiple light sources, because there's photos of them coming down the lander, and the astronauts are lit up where they shouldn't be lit up.
Okay, shouldn't be according to who?
Computer modeling
Okay, but
and photography experts.
okay, but photography experts are not necessarily physicists, right? Okay. So physics,
Yep.
okay, although the sun is the main source of illumination, it's not the only overriding. It's a source, it's the main source, but there's actually the lunar ground,
Right.
which bounces all the light back up. The sunlight is being scattered, reflected off the ground in every which way.
Right.
So a small fraction of it scatters into shadows. And there's multiple sources of light because it's coming from the sun. You can actually have light from the earth as we see the light of the moon. There's reflections on the lander and lights in the lander, and it's bouncing off their suits. So the shadows actually are physics. It works.
Lots would disagree. One of the other things then with the lander is that if it actually did land on the moon, the crater that it would have created and the dust cloud surrounding it would have been completely different.
Oh crap! You know what? I had a note on this, and then I didn't save it. But it's actually because of the soft landing, because of gravity. It's more like memory foam,
Right.
they say. So it doesn't create a hard pressed crater rather, a hard pressed crater like one would expect.
Interesting. I have not heard that.
Yeah. Unfortunately, like I said, I had a note on it and I didn't save it. So maybe I can go back and grab it again.
Let's come back to that after this short break. Also, when we come back, there'll be more photographic evidence and my theory to unpack. Be right back. Okay, so we've covered the dust cloud and the crater, the flag. What else do you got?
Well, we talked about the shadows, but we didn't really talk about the stars.
Right.
And
that's another popular thing why aren't there any stars?
Yeah. But I'm sure you yourself, conspiracy, could take on the role of science and debunk this one, because I'm sure you know what I'm going to say.
I know what you're going to say, but go ahead.
Camera aperture.
Yep.
Okay. So explain that to the folks.
Well, depending on how open or closed the aperture is, and the aperture is the amount of light that's let into the camera, and it also creates like a depth of field. The larger the aperture, the more light that comes in. For really dark areas, it's got to be wide open. So some of the details in the background get blurred out. That's a lot of those photographs that you see of people's portraits. They're in super focus, but everything else in the background is all blurred out. So it's the same kind of principle.
And
there.
folks, he can talk about this because he is actually a skilled, trained professional photographer. So he knows what he's talking about. And so that's how you know all the exposures of the astronauts, it's a matter of the aperture and the lighting because they're daylight exposures. The moonwalks were all made during the lunar morning. You don't see the sun. I mean, you don't see the stars anyway when the sun is out, but also the surface is brightly illuminated from the sun because it was the lunar morning. And also with respect to the, again, it just ties into what we talked about, the shadows too, the lighting, with the astronauts wearing, their bright white spacesuits that are highly reflective and whatnot. So it was, the aperture had to be, I guess, wide open for that shot. And so the stars are obscured and there's a lot of lighting.
Yeah, and the astronauts weren't able to adjust the camera because what they took up there was a Hasselblad medium format camera. So it's very finicky when you're using it with your hands, let alone in space gloves. So they couldn't change any of the settings. So it pretty much had to be set up prior to launch. So everything was wide open, and because that way you can get most things in focus.
And didn't I read as well that it was actually adhered to the front of his suit?
Yeah, that's another thing. One of the cameras was attached.
Yeah.
So they couldn't, they were very limited in what they could do,
Yeah.
take pictures.
And folks, if you're curious, again, he really knows what he's talking about with respect to the Hasselblad medium format camera because he's shot medium format. So
Yep.
I like it when you talk photography. It's very cool. And then, there's this other guy, Ralph Rene. Have you heard of him?
I think so.
He wrote a book called NASA Mooned America. Oh, that's funny. So he said there's a shot of them practicing putting the flag down in NASA headquarters.
Right.
And that was them practicing for faking it.
Right.
Well, why does it have to be that confounding? Why couldn't they actually be practicing putting the flag down for when they're actually going to go put it on the moon? Do you know what I mean? Like he said, do you actually want your astronauts practicing before they go to space? Yes, right? You would hope they would practice before they go to space.
Yeah, every part of the mission is played out and redone and tested and retested.
Exactly.
Before launch. And even
Yeah, we were recording.
okay, I think I was going to say Buzz Aldrin, not Buzz Aldrin, sorry. Let me start over there. Neil Armstrong. A lot of people think he just jumped out of the lander and said one small step for man, blah, blah, blah. But that was rehearsed and wrote out beforehand. Because could you imagine what he could have said? First thing that came to his mind is like, holy shit, we're on the moon.
If my mom could see me now.
Yeah. So that had to be...
It could be anything.
Yeah, so that would have had to have been completely scripted.
Yeah. And every little nuance is practiced because there's very little margin for error. Even something as small as a footstep because, they only have a certain amount of line on their suit. And, that's what the whole point of that movie, oh crap, what was it? Interstellar? No. What's the one with George Clooney and Sandy Bullock?
Oh, Gravity?
Yeah. So, I mean, that's not the whole point of the movie, but, you don't want to end up free floating. So everything's really practiced anyway. It's like, rocket science. It is rocket science for a reason, right? It's very, very scientific and technical. It's the same thing as you don't want your surgeon to just slice you open without practicing.
Right.
So one other thing that Ralph Rene guy said was there's a photo of them upon their return where they don't look very excited. And he says it's evidence that they're embarrassed for lying to the public that they supposedly went to the moon, whereas they actually were vacationing in Vegas for a few days or something
Yeah.
ridiculous like that.
I don't know about the vacationing in Vegas thing, but it is true that the astronauts over the years have gotten fairly confrontational with people when they've brought this up to them. And some have interpreted it as, yeah, they faked it and they don't want to talk about it.
Yeah.
And Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong, they've both have said controversial things over the years about it being fake and
Well,
faked.
okay, so on that note, can you imagine you sacrifice your life, your family, you could possibly be left in space to die by accident. You could blow up on exit or reentry. Like there's so many things that can go wrong. And then people are accusing you of faking it,
Right.
you know? Like that's I wouldn't blame them for getting upset. With respect to this photo, okay, you just got back to Earth. Imagine the most intense jet lag you've ever had. What was the most intense jet lag you've ever had?
I think coming from Roswell, New Mexico.
You didn't fly in that.
Well, coming back from Roswell, I went from Roswell, I took a bus to Albuquerque, and then from Albuquerque to Salt Lake City to Seattle to Vancouver. And finally,
That's not jet lag.
no, but like 2 days later, I got into Vancouver and I was so tired.
Okay, so that's the most tired you've ever been?
Well, jet lagged.
That's not jet lag. You
Sure it is.
didn't take a jet and you were in the same time zone.
No, well, Roswell's in a different time zone.
Oh, right. Sorry. Yeah.
It's in Eastern.
Yeah.
Because I went from Ontario straight down.
Right.
And then went over and then slowly, well, very quickly actually made my way, I think from Mountain Time or Central Time all the way over to Pacific Time
Right.
with very little sleep.
Because the point is, if you imagine the worst jet lag you've ever had and multiply it by a zillion, no one can actually know how tired those astronauts feel except for the astronauts themselves. Like, even the simulations that they do, all the talk and preparation that the teams of physicians and physiotherapists and everybody else do for them, no one, and especially not a writer who hasn't been to space, can say that that wasn't the look of exhaustion.
Right.
Like, he said they look embarrassed for lying to the public. Come on. How do you actually know what they're feeling? They just got back. And the elation, right? You're all elated and you're like happy and excited that you're going to the moon and everything. And then you come
Or
back to
over the
Earth.
moon.
You were over the moon, but now you're coming back down to Earth. I guess that's where that saying comes from.
I guess. And I guess what stays in Vegas, or what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas.
Yeah. Well, we'll never know.
Or will we? There's UFO hearings happening right now, and disclosure is imminent.
UFO. We're talking about going to the moon.
I know, but all this stuff it's all connected.
You're conflating it.
No, because one of the reasons why we went to the moon and haven't been back is that they say that there's an alien base on the moon, and they were told not to come back.
Oh. Okay.
But that's probably part of another story and another episode.
Yes.
But all this stuff, everything that we talk about really ties in together.
So I have a question for you.
Sure.
Do you think they went to the moon?
Okay, so this is where my curveball that we talked about earlier comes in. Because I think I have a slightly different take on it than a lot of people. So I think it's both, actually.
Okay.
So let me explain.
Okay.
Because this was the first time humanity was going to step on the moon, NASA and all the higher-ups had no idea if this was actually going to work.
Okay.
All their simulations and everything can't predict everything.
Exactly.
And there was a good chance that they would be lost in space and not come back.
Right.
It was also being broadcast live. Oh, I'll come. I forgot about the tapes being lost. The NASA moon landing tapes, they've been lost.
What?
Yeah, the original tapes.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, so that's another thing that a few years ago they went looking for the original tapes because of the way it was all being transmitted. It was coming. Parts of it was coming in from Australia and then over in Europe and over in
Okay.
the
Okay.
US.
Yeah.
And then the feed was all being put back together. So what everybody saw on TV wasn't actually a direct feed like we would see TV today, live television. It was actually a camera filming a little monitor
Okay.
on a TV screen.
Okay.
And that's how they recorded it. But that tape and all those tapes have all gone missing.
Wow.
Now, NASA has said that it was part of like a purge of data because of storage space issues back in the day. Kind of like what the BBC talked about when
Oh.
losing all the Doctor Who
Yeah.
episodes.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
Kind of the same thing because the old technology, they all it required a lot of storage. Not like
Right.
today that you can get a hard drive and fit like 1,000 hours of stuff on it.
Right.
It required warehouses for the smallest amount of footage.
Yeah, that's for sure.
So it's gone missing.
Wow.
Yep.
Okay.
So, anyways, that's a whole other thing.
Okay.
But that's also why people are thinking that the moon landing was faked, is because they wanted to go back to the original tapes and see if they could extract any additional information.
Oh,
Because
wow.
also some of the photographs that have come back, people put them through, amateurs have put them through Photoshop and adjusted the brightness and contrast, and they say that there's they can see beams in the sky, like in the sky that's from like a warehouse.
Oh my gosh. Come on.
And they see other things in the background that you can't see in the dark, but by adjusting the contrast, they're there. So they wanted to go back to these original tapes and and have a look for themselves and do some proper testing on the original images and the original footage. The other thing from the footage, or sorry, the photographs, there's a lot of, well, there's several images with they were marked with crosshairs and crop marks on the camera, and they were overlaid onto the photos, so NASA could judge distance and
Okay.
precise locations and everything.
Okay, sure.
In some of the photos, the crop marks and crosshairs are underneath objects, looking like it was faked. The images were faked because there was no consistency. It looked like everything should be on the same level. Like the crosshairs and all the registration marks should all be on top of the image, but some of them were underneath, like the lander, or caught in the background. So they weren't placed in there properly. So the theory is that they're manipulated, and they just, because of the technology in the 60s, they couldn't properly do it like how they could today.
Well, I mean, if the technology was there to send them to the moon, couldn't they fix a photo?
It was a lot harder to. There was no computers to manipulate photos, so everything had to be done either in camera or in post production in the darkroom.
Right.
You couldn't just feed it into a computer, scan it into a computer, and use the clone tool or layers in Photoshop and fix it. So everything had to have been done in the darkroom, cutting out, masking. It would have been a really hard procedure to get it exactly right. So that's why some of them aren't as perfect as maybe they could have been.
But if you're going to fake a photo, if you're going to fake something for a hoax that 400,000 people worked on, are you going to do a good job? Are you going to do the best job you can to ensure that that hoax succeeds?
Yeah, and some of the stuff slipped through the cracks. Like they didn't have the tight security as they do today. Like everybody was working on the project was like the Manhattan Project. They were all compartmentalized and they were all given certain tasks, and nobody else knew what anybody else was doing for security.
Ooh, on that note though, people, if you haven't watched Severance, you got to watch Severance.
Yeah,
Oh my God, that's a good show on Apple Plus. Anyway, I
good.
digress.
Go and check it out. Okay, so all these things, going back to what I said earlier about yes, they went to the moon and yes, they faked it. But how can that be possible?
How can that be possible?
So, with the scale and magnitude of this production going to the moon and not knowing if they're going to be able to bring them back, they could blow up on the launch pad. They could stay on the lander could stay on the moon and not the engines might not fire to get them back up and home.
So with all the
With all
hypotheticals,
the hypotheticals, they faked the pictures and they faked the landing. In the event that the mission was a failure, they could have gone to the moon and shown the fake landing, and then had them die on re-entry. But the U.S. would have won the race to the moon.
okay.
So as long as they got to the moon, they didn't even really have to get to the moon. They just had to get off the ground into space, and then they had all the images leading up to and after the moon landing was all staged. And then so there's kind of two parallel things going on here.
Oh, I follow you.
Yeah.
But do you actually think they landed there?
Oh, I think they did.
And do you think they actually returned as the same three living men to Earth
I think they did, but I
Okay.
think the images and everything that we saw is all fake.
as contingencies?
Yeah.
In case it went bad.
In case it went bad. Because could you imagine live television and the door opens up and Neil Armstrong falls out because they died because of a fire or something? They couldn't risk that on live television.
But we watched the Challenger blow up.
Yeah, I know, but that was unexpected.
Well, that would have been unexpected too, though.
No, but this was the first time they went to the moon. We've been to space a bunch of times.
Okay.
This is the first time humanity has left the planet to land on another body in the solar system, and we were fighting the Russians in the Cold War
Okay.
for the race to the moon.
Okay.
The Russians had already beat us, and I say us as in
Yeah.
the West.
Yeah.
They had Sputnik in space first, the first satellite. They had the first man in space, Yuri Gagarin, and the U.S., if they didn't make it to the moon before the Russians did, we would be living in a very different place right now.
Okay.
So it was of utmost importance for them to get to the moon first. It didn't matter if they came back.
Okay.
As long as they showed that they landed on the moon, the mission would have been a success. Because they could have said anything on the way on coming back.
So you think that they did actually succeed, but they had all this other stuff in case something went really wrong.
Exactly. And I don't know if Stanley Kubrick was the director of the fake moon landing, but
Yeah.
somebody was.
So I guess the question we have to ask is your theory believable? And, maybe I gotta say there is a shadow of a doubt crossing my mind because up until this point, I wholeheartedly believed that they went to the moon and everything was real and all that. And I still believe they went to the moon. But the way you've explained how maybe they had these contingencies in place, I never considered that. And even when I was reading through the debunking, to me, it's always been kind of either or.
Right. And I think it's both.
Yeah, that's a very interesting theory. I'd love to hear what everybody else thinks.
Yeah, tell us in the comments. Send us an email. Let us know what you think. If my theory is too far out there, or if it makes some sense.
Yeah, I don't know, Mulder. It just might. It just might make sense. It just might.
Got to think outside the box. Because there for a while, I thought maybe they didn't go to the moon, and maybe Apollo 13 was their first real attempt to go to the moon, and they still couldn't do it. And that's why we've been stuck in low Earth orbit for the last 30 years.
Oh, okay, right. Yeah.
But then the more I looked into it over time, I think they actually went to the moon, but this was all a contingency plan to ensure the success, at least on the surface of it working.
Right.
We'll have to leave it there this week. For Science and Conspiracy, see you next week, and remember, being paranoid is smart. If you like the episode, don't forget to subscribe. You can download us on any of the major podcasting platforms. This week's episode of Science vs. Conspiracy Over Coffee was produced by Lethologica. Writing and research was done by Bob Homer and Jennifer Timer.